I think the point, I'm not into bios, but the point that should mention is I work professionally in the field of geopolitics and on borders, not just with Israeli-Palestinian borders. Actually, I work on borders all around the world, but I've particularly worked on this issue of borders, potential borders for a two-state solution. I would say over 20, 25 years of track two stuff since Oslo and even before Oslo. As you're probably all aware, there's a lot of track two which has gone on different topics, whether it be borders or territory or Jerusalem or refugees or holy sites and so on. And we've been looking continuously at borders. We're always within the context of, how do you territorially configure a two-state solution? Now, there are two, in a sense, simple answers. One is, you don't even have to think about it. There was a border back there in 67. That's the default line. That's the green line. Let's go back there with all the problems that may occur. And, that's what there is, full stop. But we all know that's problematic. And I'm saying problematic even from the perspective of someone who is in favor of a two-state solution. Obviously, people who don't want there to be any form of two-state solution, well, I mean, the border issue can be a bit of a red herring. Now, that's as true of let's say, the far right in Israel who don't want a Palestinian state, have never wanted one, or those on the far left who say, let's have a single binational, secular democracy of all Israelis and Palestinians. Of course, their political positions are as diametrically opposed as possible, but their territorial positions are the same. They both believe in a single territory without a border. That does me out of business. So I believe in two states with borders. But of course, they are both ideological positions. And what's increasingly happening in the past few years is that people like myself, who have always been a strong supporter politically of two states, maybe because we see it as the best of all the evils. We can't think of any solution which is better, although we know it's problematic to implement. As time goes on, as more settlements are out there on the ground, as geographical changes take place, and we look and we revisit every year or 2 years the issue of how do you demarcate a border, we find it increasingly impossible, or increasingly difficult. And once you say impossible, you've finished the argument. Increasingly difficult. And therefore, there have been a number of think tanks over the past year or two. I've been involved in one at the Shashar Center at the Hebrew University. I know of at least 2 others which are taking place, of saying, can you sort of think out beyond the territorial box, beyond the classic territorial box which says a state has fixed boundaries, even in this so-called era of globalization and a borderless world. Well, I think, as a scholar of borders, we all agree the last 2 years has really put an end to that discussion of borderless worlds. We just need to look at what's happening in and around Europe, and what's happening in the Middle East with the total breakup of the Sykes-Picot ideas. Someone's going to have to redraw some borders out there in Iraq and Syria in the next 5 or 10 years. We would think so. It's very hard to see how they can go back to the original borders, what with the issue of the Kurds, the issue of the Islamic State, which may or may not continue to exist, and so on. So borders are being redrawn. In some places in the world, they're disappearing because of globalization, because of harmony, like inside the EU, and other places they're being drawn because of security issues, and they're being reconstructed. Israel and Palestine, Israel and the West Bank, have this big border issue still on the table if we're going to move towards a two-state solution. I want to sort of make a comment here and say we're not there at the moment. We're not sitting around this sort of table at the moment. We were 10 years ago, and we were 15 years ago. We're further away from resolving the Israel-Palestine conflict, in my view, than we were 10 or 15 years ago. And I think that resonates some of the comments we've heard in the last few days and weeks from Bougie Herzog, the head of the Labour Party, who would like, in a sense, to get back there, but is also raising questions about the traditional pragmatic ways of drawing borders. I think there's another important point to make that we often don't take into account. Next year, 2017, is 50 years since the Six-Day War. I mean, we don't always take the time component sufficiently into consideration when we're thinking about the Israel-Palestine conflict. We're always thinking, well, 2 important dates for Israel. One was the establishment of the state in 49, and one was the Six-Day War, which changed a lot of the internal political configurations and so on. But we forget that from the establishment of the state to the Six-Day War, 18 years, and there have been 50 years since that. So the amount of change, not just territorial, political, social, religious, cultural, but obviously territorial change, which has gone on in that space of time, which is already 3 times as long as the period that preceded it, is obviously going to make such significant changes on the ground that it's a bit simplistic today to come and say, well, let's just take a photo of what was in the day before the 6-Day War and let's go back to it. Yes, there's a lot of discussion about justice and morality, and depending on which side of the political spectrum you're on, you'll adopt a different position on that one. But of course, it's too simplistic in terms of the realities of the changes, including the geographical and the territorial changes. So you do have to rethink the way you draw lines and you draw borders. Another point I want to make is to say that thinking beyond the territorial box, in the sense of, can you create 2 systems of power? Call them states if you want, call them something else if you want, but 2 systems of power which actually don't have very rigidly defined territories, and I'll explain what I mean in a few minutes. Does it sound fictional? Most people would say yes, it sounds very fictional, that you can't have sort of cross citizenship or people living within shared spaces but belonging to different political entities. Even I think to a certain extent it's semi-fictional at the moment. But I'm a great believer in what I call familiarity discourse. And what I mean by that is that, 20 years ago at the time of Oslo, even Rabin wasn't talking about 2 states. And people like myself, but I'm a minor cog, much more important people, were writing op-eds and writing articles about 2 states, 2 states, 2 states. So that even if most of the reaction was against it, it was nevertheless, it became part of the familiar public discourse. It was a less threatening discourse, and Palestinian statehood, the idea of 2 states, became part of an accepted discourse. And even you had Arik Sharon and Ehud Olmert, sort of for different reasons, it's true, for demographic reasons, but saying, this is what we have to move towards, 2 states. I think the same can be said for something to do with borders, and that is to say that starting about 10 years ago, we tended to talk a lot more about redrawing the borders, but not just that it benefits Israel and the settlements, but that you would have to have land exchanges or territorial exchanges. I think I've even sat in this forum and spoken about that in the past. Again, at the time when it was first mentioned, the idea that we would have exchanges, that it wouldn't just be Israel redrawing the boundaries into the West Bank, but it could also happen the other way, so that the actual amount of territory which each political entity has at the end of the day is roughly the same. That seemed very fictional at the time, and more people wrote about it. There was the Beilin-Abu Mazen agreement long before Abu Mazen replaced Arafat, and it became an accepted part of the discourse. You would go to Track 2 meetings, Israelis and Palestinians and others, and we would talk about land exchanges and exchanges. I actually live in the south of the country, just south of the West Bank, in one of the areas which was at the time designated for a potential land exchange because it's relatively unpopulated and so on. So the point I want to make is to say things that sound fictional today, when you sort of talk about them more and more, it is a way of making them less threatening and more familiar. And I make that point because I think some of the ideas that I may suggest here may well sound very fictional at this time, and I even may feel a sense of that. But when I look at the reality of today, of where we are standing, and say, are you able to sit down today and draw that line? Are you able even to draw the line which has territorial exchanges, given some of the problems I'll mention in a minute? There's a big question. So in other words, people who are questioning the classical ways of having 2 states are today doing it from a pragmatic perspective, not just from an ideological perspective. The ideology of either the far right or the far left, who don't believe in 2-state solutions. But I'm talking about from a perspective which says, yes, we need a 2-state solution because we can't think of any better solution, even though it's not an ideal one, but we're finding it increasingly difficult to even think about how would you implement. Why is it so difficult to implement? Passage of time has allowed for many things to take place. There is no question that today, depending on whose estimates you look at, there are between 350 to 400,000 settlers or Jewish residents of the West Bank. And that's not including the whole issue of East Jerusalem, which I'm not even discussing here today. Can any Israeli government, even a left-wing government, which, as you're aware, is not going to happen in the next 5-7 years or so, and that's even being optimistic. We're not at the place of a left-wing government today, but let's sort of play hypotheses and say that suddenly there was a big revolution in Israel and tomorrow a left-wing government came to power, or a moderate left-wing government headed by someone like Herzog, let's say. So I say it's not going to happen, let's say. And they were to say, okay, we're now going back to the traditional ideas of two states. We're going to go back to something in or around the Green Line, and that means that everything over the other side of the Green Line has to be evacuated. Can any Israeli government in Israel today implement such a thing? My answer would be, and I'm coming here not as an academic, but as someone who's involved, personally in Israeli politics, who is concerned about the future of the Israeli state. I can't see how any Israeli government can implement that. Gaza was not a good precedent. Yes, it went smoother than we thought, although many people seeing the news would say it didn't go smoothly. Gaza was 7,000 people. West Bank is 400,000. Gaza was something which most of the country came in behind because they failed to understand why there should be settlements in the south of the Gaza Strip. There are far fewer people who see the same concept with relevance to the West Bank. Okay, let's move on and say you have land exchanges. However you redraw the border, so that you can keep the so-called blocks within Israel and have land exchange somewhere else, you are always going to have a significant percentage which are on the so-called wrong side of the border, which again, if you believe that all settlements have to be evacuated, you're talking about numbers 80,000, 60,000, 100,000. It's still a significant number, but there's a geopolitical issue involved here, and that is that the ones on the so-called wrong side of the border are the much more ideologically motivated settlements. They are the heartland of the settler movement, and what used to be called the Gush Emunim movement. In other words, the ones where you could potentially keep inside Israel by redrawing borders are the ones that you could potentially, if necessary, evacuate through economic compensation. The ones that you can't do that under any situation are the ones who are always going to be on the wrong side of the border, and that raises a major issue. That's where you have some of the more radical elements, the Hilltop Youth, who have more or less made it clear they're not going to sort of take the position they took in the Gaza evacuation. So it's a major problem for an Israeli government who is even in favor of these things, and we don't have a government of that nature at the time. So are there alternatives? And I'll just spend 3 or 4 minutes on that and close up, and then you can take in whatever direction you want. Are there alternatives to come in saying you can still have something which is called two states or sharing of power? No, sharing of power isn't two states. That's something completely different. But sort of two political entities where you don't have strongly defined borders. Can you have such ideas as ethnic cross-citizenship? In other words, can people all remain in situ, in their present location, including settlements? And that, of course, is a very contentious issue to raise on the table. But could you have that where they remain citizens of Israel, and then, of course, along come people like Liebman and say, well, maybe the Arab Palestinian citizens, residents of Israel, would be citizens of a Palestinian, not an Israeli state. You can imagine just how phenomenally contentious, and some of you would say fictional, such an idea is, but it's not impossible to think beyond. Can you have exclaves and enclaves, in which different pieces of territory are defined in such a way they belong to different states? Can you go back to the ideas that were circling in the 70s and were proposed very strongly by Professor Daniel Elazar at the time around the ideas of federalism, confederalism between Palestinian and Israeli entities? At the time, they weren't taken very seriously. Many of us believe they weren't taken seriously at the time. By the way, Jordan was also in the game at the time. Many of us believe they weren't taken seriously because here was Professor Elazar, who was clearly noted as one of the world's experts on federalism, but he came to Israel and he was seen as being one of these American outsiders who doesn't really understand the local context. I've been there 30 years and I'm still looked at in that way sometimes. So, that's always one of the killer arguments. Well, you grew up somewhere else, you don't really understand. We'll leave that aside for the moment. But nevertheless, are there ideas which are being refloating at the moment about ideas of federalism and confederalism? Of course, that raises much bigger issues because whereas issues of ethnicity and taxation and local government and planning are issues which can always be resolved by sharing power. The one big thing in federalism is that you have an overarching state unit, which looks normally is a single unit when it looks at issues of security and defence, which of course in this particular case are probably the key things that each side would want to keep for itself and so on. So there's a big question mark out there. But we have in the last 2 years looked at maps, we've looked at different areas, we've looked at where you could have cross-citizenship. And what we're saying is it's not an impossible thing to work your way through, although it becomes very complex. Now, of course, the other question to raise is everything that we've set up to now, which is now becoming increasingly difficult to implement, if relatively simple solutions are difficult to implement, why should a more complex solution be easy to implement, which of course it isn't. Of course it isn't. It's much easier to go back to the idea of saying, despite everything, we have to draw a border. Despite everything, we may have to come to the settlements and say, take your choice, which no Israeli government really wants to be in that situation. So take your choice. Either you do evacuate, or you're going to end up being in the territory of a state which doesn't have Israeli Jewish sovereignty. I think it's important to say, people often forget, the settler movement, particularly the ideological component of the settler movement, for them the concept of Greater Israel is very important. And we shouldn't brush it aside as just being political opportunism. It's not political opportunism. We may agree or disagree with that particular ideological religious perspective, but for those who believe in it, it's a very, very real perspective. So their idea that having to give up and evacuate their homes, of a Greater Israel, is a very serious ideological problem for many of them, which is why many would refuse to do so, even for compensation. But we shouldn't forget that in that same religious ideological perspective, so too is the concept of Jewish sovereignty. And that hasn't been put out enough on the table. The idea that maybe you have to make the choice between living in the land of Israel or living under Jewish sovereignty. And if you have to make the choice between that, which is the one you would prefer to do, where you would feel better, where you would feel safer? And that has never been put on the table as an ideological compromise, which has to be made. And today the settler movement feels less and less that it has to deal with that issue, because today, of course, you have a fairly right-of-centre government. Some would say the most right-of-centre government you've had in Israel for a long time. You have certain ministers such as Bennett, who are even for the first time coming and saying, let's abrogate Oslo and let's simply throw the concept of two states out the window. It's no longer relevant, and that's a new discourse which has come up on the right. And if I started by saying something about time, I'll end about saying something about time. And that is on the Israeli side of the perspective, and on the settler side of the perspective, I think their perception of what time does in the conflict has changed very significantly. I think until about 5 or 10 years ago, there used to be the idea that, and I know this is a bit of a generalization, I apologize for that, but there used to be the idea that on the Palestinian or Arab side of the perspective, time is in our favor. We have more dynamic natural growth, we have sitting power, a certain sort of Middle Eastern cultural way of looking at time. We can sit and wait, and until the demography gets to such a situation where there's parity, and then Israel has a problem with the whole concept of being a democratic state and not giving everybody rights and so on. Whereas on the Jewish side, which is why I think Sharon and Olmert made the switch they made, was that time works against us. That demography is going in such a way that we will lose the Jewish majority of the state and our raison d'etre and so on. Amongst the settlers, there's been a change in that conception. They now are increasingly adopting the idea that time works in our favour. Because the idea that today you have 400,000 people, residents, Jewish residents, settlers of the West Bank was unthinkable 20 years ago. It's increased. I mean, it was less than half that number at the time of Oslo, at the time of Rabin. There's natural growth. There are younger groups coming in. There are, believe it or not, 3rd and 4th generation settlers. There are people who went there in '67, young religious families, married young, had large families. They already have grandchildren. Some may even have their first great-grandchildren after nearly 45 years, all of whom have only ever known living in the West Bank as their home. That's a completely different perception, certainly to my generation and maybe to other generations as well. So they also have a different perception of time today. They see that the country is increasingly going from the left to the centre and the centre to the right. The right, if it doesn't always promote actively settlement, certainly supports it in principle, certainly is against the idea of evacuation. So there's also a different conception of what time brings about. And they say, well, we don't have to be the majority in the West Bank, but 400,000 is a very significant number. Give us another 10 years, we'll be 500,000, or less than 10 years. So I think that's a very important change that we don't think about sufficiently, because we tend to be very sort of tied up in the ideas and the configurations that were around at the time of Oslo when we first put forward a real serious discussion of two states. So the question we're asking here is, are there alternative ways, I would say, of power sharing or of having two political entities, if and when we ever got back to the negotiation table, and we're nowhere near there at the moment with the present leadership on both sides of the political spectrum? Are there alternative ways if we think that it is no longer possible to draw a single border?